Welcome to the OD Learning Lab, a podcast exploring leadership, organization development, and adult learning. Through conversations with scholars, practitioners, emerging voices, and archival recordings from the field, we examine the ideas, experiences, theories, and practices that help people, teams, and organizations learn, grow, and change.
All right. Well, let's get this show started off. Welcome back to our listeners who have decided to join us again, and welcome back to you, Kyle. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here as always.
Yeah. So just a brief reminder about, the podcast and what we're here to do today is, this podcast is about where research and practice meet adult learning and leadership and organizational development. That's our little tagline, which I need to really commit to memory and remember. That's what it's about. But yeah, it's a place and space for us to connect research, connect practice, and really think about sort of all the different places where adult learning is embedded in. And so, yeah, looking forward to our conversation today. And just to kick us off, I really want to frame today's episode with really just for you and I thinking about sort of how do we kind of look back and reflect back on the interviews that we've done so far, and what their meanings are, what we've learned about those interviews, where we've had some hiccups along the way, and sort of where we see sort of next steps, especially now that our proposal has been accepted to AERC. What does that mean, next steps for us? What does that look like? What have we learned?
Yeah, definitely. And AERC, the Adult Education Research Conference, for those that are not
Yes.
in the know.
Yes, thank you. All of our acronyms. We know that in this field and everywhere, we can have acronyms that just kind of roll off the tongue. But what does that mean and what does that look like? So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation today to kind of spend time together chatting and talking about sort of what we've learned over the last 6 to 7 months now that we've been recording and doing these. And I think we have at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interviews under our belt. Yeah.
Yep.
So really looking to kind of recap those, talk a little bit about sort of where we're going next steps, and think about sort of what this means and what kind of we're getting out of this.
Yep, that works for me. So I'm kind of kicking it off. I think the first interview that I ever did was with Holly, and she talked about specifically coaching. And so some of the things that I got from that is, one, just how to do a podcast and not do it in a public coffee shop, which was fun.
Right.
And that was before we were even doing kind of this format and before you came on. But yeah, coaching and adult education and adult learning, I think it's extremely important, specifically when it's like supporting someone through a particular process or organizational challenge or challenge in general, right? And what I really took away from that was the space of being someone that's supportive and non-judgmental, and also not trying to be an expert when it comes to, I know it's the best way to do X. I know the way to navigate this issue. It's really about empowering the client and having them come up with their own solutions. Very adult learner centered approach with non-judgmental, self-directed in a way as well.
Right. Well, I know also after you did the interview, you introduced me to 2 different schools of thought around coaching. And so you and I both looked into potentially going and looking at coaching certification, which is something I'm still interested in. But it's just interesting that there are different schools of thought in terms of how the coaching practice is done, and just different ways of really approaching and helping a client kind of work through challenges and problems and situations. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. I know one of those, well, both of them are actually based here in Cleveland, I believe at Case Western Reserve University, correct?
Yep, there's Case Western Reserve University, and then for their specific, more of your traditional coaching models, I think they might use Grow. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is the Gestalt Institute, in which it's very Gestalt oriented.
Yeah. So definitely still interested in kind of taking a look at those and seeing sort of how they can sort of inform our practice as adult educators. But I think also kind of then sliding into sort of the next interviews. I think I was your next interview for technical assistance, but I'm also kind of connecting that with the interview that we had with Dr. Catherine Hansman on mentoring. And I'm connecting those because I see some connections between the mentoring, technical assistance, and coaching, because I think that the practices are very similar. While they're distinct kind of disciplines, there is some overlap between them. From my perspective, having done technical assistance as a consultant, there is some coaching that you do with organizations and with clients to really kind of help them think about, one, evidence-based practices, in sort of what is the practices that are out there and how do you translate, both theory and how do you translate sort of these frameworks that are out there that might be a little bit kind of wordy and up there. How do you kind of break those down to everyday practice? So I do see there being some overlap between sort of coaching, technical assistance, but then also, as Dr. Hansman talked with us in terms of mentoring and helping someone in terms of their own professional development, kind of get to that next stage of their life.
Agreed. And I think, like, when we look at the potential differences or the differences between coaching, mentoring, and technical assistance, with coaching, there's really this approach of the coach is not the expert when it comes to helping the client. The client is their own expert. They know their own organization, they know their own issues and things around those lines. And
Hmm.
I think specifically with mentoring, I think there's a similar approach. However, the mentor has that lived experience. The coach does not need to have a lived experience when it comes to that organization. For example, you could have a coach that isn't a faculty member coach someone that is faculty in order to problem solve or troubleshoot or kind of further their professional development within
Hmm.
higher education.
Right.
From a mentoring standpoint, it would be I am the mentor would be someone that's a faculty member that has experience, that has overcome like challenges within higher education and is offering kind of coaching, but also advice based on their
Hmm.
lived experience and how that may actually help the client.
Hmm.
So, like, for example, a coach wouldn't be like, hey, this is the tenure process. This is what you have to do. Here are the steps. A coach would
Hmm.
be like, tell me about your understanding of the tenure process. What are the barriers or what are the challenges that you're facing at this point in time? And then coaching them through that. Where can you find information in order to help you through this process? Maybe
Right.
seek out a mentor. So there's a little bit of a difference when it comes to like those areas, but I think there's a lot of overlap because the similar skills, communication, the ability to understand the client's system, I
Hmm.
think is extremely important.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and those are some differences. And I would add to that, in terms of technical assistance, I think the difference with technical assistance is sometimes organizations bring in people who are the subject matter experts or the SMEs. So oftentimes organizations or entities will bring in someone who has a niche area of knowledge, let's just say around apprenticeship. So someone who is really understanding of what are the best practices around apprenticeship, what are the apprenticeship models, and that's kind of their niche area, and they want to grow their organization in that direction. So what they will then do is hire a consultant or someone who has that subject matter expertise and is sort of seen as the expert within that field to come in. And I think sort of where the line kind of connects is that while they might be the expert, they're taking sort of those evidence-based practices and kind of distilling them down to really think about how does that fit within this community-based organization or within this entity to help the staff and the practitioners there become their own experts and learn those practices to fit it within their systems. So again, I think it's part of that systems thinking where you
Mhm.
might be the expert, but then how does that fit within the everyday kind of, as I call it, the boots on the ground when you're working within an organization and you're working with people with lived experiences? What does that look like in everyday practice? So I think that again kind of gets into some of the differences between sort of some of those areas that we've kind of have interviewed so far.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think for me also, when I think back to just kind of recapping those episodes, with coaching with Holly, the technical assistance, mentoring, professional development, and then our conversation with Dr. Gretchen Birch, is I think what's I see as a through line for all of them also is just how embedded adult education or adult learning practices, theories, and frameworks are within each of those. I think oftentimes our experience or my experience has been sometimes people don't understand adult learning or adult learning theory and sort of what it is. And they often think about just adult basic education. And for
Mhm.
those who are within the field, we know the theories, we know the frameworks, and we know the history. And so it's interesting to look at sort of these areas and see sort of adult learning embedded through all of them and how those experiences and frameworks shape organizations, how they shape practice, how they shape professional development. And while these organizations might not call it adult learning, they might call it leadership development, they might call it organizational development. I think that there is those of us who sort of understand the field, understand that there's that line, that connection of these frameworks that sort of inform the practice.
Agreed. Agreed. And I feel like throughout these interviews, and I think we have to talk about our own subjectivity when it comes to this, is that
Yeah,
well, you and I like tend to be community oriented. And
that's
so
right.
like the way that we kind of perceive adult learning is very much in this community space, communities of practice. And so like I think a through line for a lot of these interviews and the way that we connect it to our own like research and experience is through those communities of practice where we're saying like, oh, this mentoring communities of practice, kind
Yeah.
of goes into this peer-to-peer learning when we're talking about learning with adult education, right? So when we're talking about Gretchen's interviews, using those within the classroom, but also using those in our professional practices through communities of practice was also huge. So I think that's the other thing to kind of call out here too is that like there is our own bias when it comes to this. And I'm learning throughout this whole
Yeah.
process as well, when I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Like Gretchen talked about something that, you know, the importance of narrative when it comes to adult learning, right? And so like that might be in the back of my mind, but it's not always
Hmm.
forefront. And so like a lot of times through these interviews, I'm learning myself as to be a better professor, to be a better teacher, to be a better practitioner. And so there's a lot of things that I'm learning through this process.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that, there's definitely a lot that I'm learning through this process. And one of the things that, you and I have talked about before, that my role, particularly because I'm not always in an academic setting, sometimes I will dip
Mhm.
my toe back into the academic setting as an adjunct faculty. And so I appreciate those moments of being able to dip back into teaching, a master's course in adult learning. Just this fall, I taught, the course at Cleveland State University for master's level students. And it was a great refresher of theories that I've studied, frameworks that I've studied, but it was great to be reintroduced to them again. And so, as a practitioner, I'm every day when I'm developing trainings, I'm developing tools and working with organizations, I'm helping them apply some of these tools and theories to sort of their work. But I'm not always thinking about, is this Mesero or is this, or someone else, I'm just thinking about how does this get applied? Because if I were to bring that
Mhm.
into the organization, they're like, okay, well, we don't need to know that. We just need to know how this is done. And so I think it's important to also just kind of, for myself, have this space to kind of be able to be reintroduced or reminded of sort of the frameworks and think about sort of where they're coming from and then how they're broken down, but then how they get applied within, these organizations in terms of experience and the work that we do.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like with our future podcasts, we're going to go a little bit more in depth with some of those foundational adult learning theories. And
Mhm.
what we're probably going to see, well, I know we're going to see this is the truth of the field, is that we're going to start to see that like within specific, like when we talk about transformational learning, there's going to be nuances when we talk about what a Mesero has versus a Hogan. That Hogan being more of a contemporary scholar in the field, because what'll happen is then when we have this conversation about the nuances of that theory, we could see that where can that theory specifically be applied, right?
Mhm,
So like a lot of times, like within my own research, when I think of transformational learning or any type of learning theory, like experiential,
mhm,
I'll look at it from like so like police officers. There are certain types of elements of like transformational learning. If I did like a Mesero perspective on it, it would be like this moment could be transformational. But versus if I take a more conservative approach when it comes to transformation, I might be like, is this moment actually transformative or are they just getting skill building knowledge and
mhm,
awareness? And how do I actually make this so it's more transformative based on these more contemporary theories? And so, like,
mhm.
I think that's going to happen when we get further into the literature, further into these interviews with these previous scholars, these foundational scholars,
Yeah,
and then these contemporary scholars that are really gonna it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be a
yeah,
fun little contrast. And I think it's gonna challenge me as well, just to kind of see like where are my intellectual slash theoretical chops, and can I strengthen them a little bit more through here? Because trust me, there are moments where I'm like, oh, geez, I didn't know that about that particular theory. I need to go
yeah,
a deeper dive into that.
yeah. There's a couple things you said that, will be a challenge, but also interesting that I'm really looking forward to. One is just stretching my intellectual chops and my scholarly chops in terms of just refreshing myself about these theories, as I said earlier, but also getting into sometimes, have that imposter syndrome where it's like, okay,
Mm,
I don't do this every day. I'm not a scholar every day. So, really thinking about, who am I to be talking about, some of these foundational theorists and, sitting with Gretchen Bersch and talking about sort of her interviews is
Uh,
just like, wow, it's just kind of mind blowing. As I've shared with you, I wrote an article some years ago with my community of practice, and it was called Waiting for the Expert to Arrive. And it was exactly about that. It was like sort of this identity kind of, if we felt like we were imposters, who are we to be scholars? And so we sort of came into that community of practice to learn from another scholar. And so I think that kind of same mindset is something that this space will create. Is, you and I both, have some level of understanding of the frameworks and theories, but also we're going to continue to learn. And I'm really interested in hearing sort of those recordings that, Gretchen will share with us, but then to really think about how do we then connect them with, some of the contemporary voices that are currently within the field of adult learning, but then really for me getting into bringing also practitioners into this, bringing practitioners who are out there every day doing the work, using these theories without maybe even knowing that they're using these theories, and then finding out what that looks like and who some of these scholars or practitioners are that are out in the field of adult learning, and kind of giving them recognition and sort of giving them their kudos for, wow, here you are doing the work and using these frameworks and kind of helping make that connection and bridging it.
100%. I
Mhm.
agree. So you made me think about a few things. So like trying not to deviate too much from our conversation here, but like that imposter syndrome's huge. And I
Mhm.
think that even like with so I'm doing some research on scholarly development with students, and that imposter syndrome is forefront. That's something that they experience a day to day basis when they're in their
Mhm.
PhD program. They're like, do I belong? And one thing that from one of the studies that we did together as a community of practice with these students is that we found out that being a scholar is not in isolation, it's within a community. And so what ends up so to your point about the communities of practice, to your point about scholarly development or just the kind of squishing that imposter syndrome, it's really about talking to other people in your field, having those conversations, leaning into that discomfort
Mhm.
and learning that you're not alone.
Yeah.
And I think that's huge. The other point that I was gonna bring out is that the waiting for the expert to arrive. I suspect from that you were like bringing that we had the one scholar, which I suspect was Kate Monahan, right,
Right.
involved in your research. But I think from what I understand is that it was actually she came out as that expert, but also you all had your own expertise when it
Right.
comes to whatever type of scholarly research or something that you were doing because you come from your own worldviews and your own experiences, your own professional backgrounds, and that added
Mhm.
to the rich tapestry of what you were creating together as a community.
Yeah, so you said that so much better than I did. Yes. But you're right. It was that we each came with a certain level of expertise. But I think part of that experience of our community of practice was that we initially, as students and, graduate students, didn't see and didn't own our expertise. And so we needed that space with her, Kate Monahan, there as sort of our mentor and sort of our guide to help us kind of tease that expertise out within each of our areas to show that we were experts while we were kind of junior experts within certain fields, but we did bring that into the space. And, forgive me, I'm going to go into a little bit of my own research here where I talked about liminal spaces. And
Yeah, yeah,
so I really appreciate sort of having those places of liminal space where there sort of are defined sort of rites of passage that people sort of go through to really sort of begin that level of identity development. So as you talk about, your graduate students, I think that they also kind of we create for them or hopefully create for them these kind of liminal spaces where they can practice sort of that scholarly identity without it being too threatening in terms of being out in the open world where they get to sort of begin finding who they are as scholars and defining what that is for them. And I know that that's what that was for us, is that liminal space of kind of really, yeah, sharpening our chops in terms of our scholarly identity and figuring out who we were and getting comfortable with it. Similar to how I would say you and I now are doing this with,
exactly.
podcasting. We're not experts with podcasting. And I think, again, that's why I find this moment very interesting and intriguing because we can look back on what we've done and be like, oh yeah, let's not do that again. Or yeah, all right, we can do that a little bit better. I think it's all part of the learning process.
It's almost like we're doing a deliberate reflection, like in experiential learning or something like that. We're like,
Hmm.
okay, what are the moments that we've learned through this experience, right? And so,
Hmm.
like, kind of embedding adult learning theory in our podcast and how we're doing it.
Yeah, most certainly. Yeah. And it's just, I think some of the key themes that have come out of that is that, learning is relational. I think we've talked about that in terms of the coaching and the mentoring. It's building that relationship with individuals that is contextual. It depends upon the
Mhm.
situation that you're in. It's practice based learning, experiential learning. But then I think also what I've learned from Gretchen is that theory needs translation. Theory needs translation in terms of being able to help people understand sort of and break down sort of what could be sometimes very dense topics and frameworks, and how do you help people break that down into everyday practice. One of the things we kept talking about, and people will hear in the interview with Gretchen is, you have this big thick textbook that has all this very dense theory in it.
Love it.
Yeah, yeah, I love it too. But then sometimes it's like, all right, what does that mean? What does that
Right.
mean, and what does that look like within the real world? And so, one of the things I really appreciated about the interview with Gretchen was she talked about, you have, this dense theory, but as we'll talk about shortly, is in her conversations for lifelong learning, she was able to sit down with a lot of these foundational theorists and really kind of get a breakdown of what that meant and really hear from them, what these theories mean and what that means to them without all this sort of dense academic text and academic jargon that sometimes goes along with it.
I agree. And I think there's a humanizing element to
Mhm.
hearing the voices or seeing the scholars behind that writing. Cause there's times that I mean, I could tell you like when I was, a young little PhD student and I was like, oh, this is unachievable and I'm never gonna get there. But seeing like people like Kate Monahan, Catherine Hansman, being able to like have them be human and see like, they make mistakes. They're
Yeah.
working through the research. They're working through like figuring out, was I right about that theory? Oh wait, no,
Yeah.
I was a little off there. And then also just kind of for Gretchen, it's really about like these interviews are saying like these are human beings
Right.
behind these theories.
Mhm.
There's a human element. There's a narrative behind it. And I think it makes it slightly more approachable when we
Yeah.
think about it that way versus like I mean I like looking at like I love the handbook of adult continuing education, which is
Yeah.
great. But sometimes you look at that and you're like, oh, there's a lot of text here. Although though honestly, it's very approachable. At least I tell students. But when you see these scholars within like conferences and stuff, you're like, "Oh, you wrote that," and then and you hear them talk, and then it just humanizes the experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that just that speaks volumes of one being able to go to conferences and see people live and have these conversations with them. But also I think it just goes to, that yeah, people also are human in terms of making mistakes and trying to figure it out. And that while you read it on paper, it's all cleaned up, polished, and published. But it has to start somewhere. And oftentimes it can start very kind of gritty and dirty and all over the place. And that, that's part of the work of figuring it out, and that it's okay to make these mistakes. And yeah, again, I think it's part of what we're learning through this process. So yeah.
The It's what I like to call it. It's
Um, uh,
going through the muck, and I think that even the muck can be it's in research all the time, but I think
mhm.
practitioners also experience that when you're like, "What's the training program that I'm gonna do? This is what the data is suggesting," and you're like, "Oh, I think it's this," and you do it, and then you do, like, some type of, let's just say, like, improvement science or, there's a framework that you like to use, human system design, is that correct?
Human centered
Center,
design. Yep.
yes.
Yep.
And so it's like you do it and it's like, "Bleh, no, it's
Yeah.
not right."
You're right. That's certainly a part of human-centered design is, sitting down and just kind of experiencing it and researching it and being okay with making mistakes because then you look at, what's the next iteration of this? You learn from it and then recreating it and redoing it so that it's better. So yeah, that definitely is a part of it. So both within research and within practice, the muck, the muck happens, the muck is
Muck.
there. And I think we have to be willing to go through the muck and figure it out. So for all those students who are out there writing papers, writing dissertations, go through the muck, get it out there, know that it'll get through that.
You're saying that like when I wrote my dissertation and Catherine Hansman sent me like 600 comments and I'm like, ah, it's okay. It's okay because it's a learning process. It's the muck. It's process. It's the process.
It's a process. So a question for you, as we think about sort of what we've accomplished, what's been most surprising for you? Has there been anything that's been surprising for you, so far in our 6, 7 month journey?
It's probably the recency effect here because like I started working on like the Gretchen interview.
Hmm.
Is that just how human scholars are? And I said this is
Hmm.
the same point, but it's just like just to hear her talk and how humble that she is, and like she's
Hmm.
really well known and renowned in our field. And she mentioned that like that was the same for the interviews that she did with scholars like
Right,
Mesmer.
right,
And she's like, they're human, they're beings. And then she was just talking about these unique characteristics. And so like that was the one thing that kind of stood out to me about that interview. And it was just like, I'm just kind of like, I want to jump into those DVDs. I want to, well, for us, it'll be audio and videos, but
right.
like, I really want to see the human side of these researchers, the human side of these foundational scholars.
Yeah,
And so that kind of stood out to me just right off the top.
yeah. I think similarly for me, I think what stands out to me is how willing people are to sit and chat and talk about their work. I think part like there's this again, I think maybe it's part of this imposter fear is where you're bothering people. I never want to bother people and it feels like I'm taking time out of their day. They're busy people. And but then when you approach people, and I know we're planning to talk with some people at the upcoming conference, is how willing people are to sit down, talk about their work, and have these conversations. And so I think that that was really surprising for me. And then again, to your point, you get to know the human side of them. So yeah, I think it was really surprising for me that people were willing to sit down and talk and have conversations and create this space of being able to learn about their work and learn about what they're doing and yeah, just chat.
And I think another just kind of thinking through this, what occurred to me is also the like a better word, the genealogy. Let's say genealogy. So the
Mhm.
genealogy of when it comes to scholarly, I guess development, but the way that scholars build off of each other, specifically within mentors, right? So like
Mhm.
going back to Catherine Hansman, right?
Right.
She talked about how her mentor influenced her, and then also her community influenced her in studying mentorship, like because of
Right.
that experience that she had driving to the university, being the only, there was only like, I forget, they were the only women's students like
Yeah.
within that. And then so they became kind of a community, learned through that, did peer mentoring.
Mhm.
And then she had that experience where she went to her first university as a faculty member and they're like challenging her because she was a woman,
Right.
and that how that impacted her, and that how she looked at power dynamics. And then that really led her to do a lot of self ethnography and
Mhm.
things, and that eventually bled into like what I did for some of my PhD work with like
Right.
communities of practice. And I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
Catherine, like we have the similar, like there's that a through line. It's because of
Mhm.
you I'm so interested in self ethnography or auto ethnography and group dynamics when it comes to ethnography. So it's really interesting kind of see that. But again, that's the narrative and how
Yeah.
she developed as a scholar, but also how that's developed me as a mentee when it comes to her own history and her perspective when it comes to the field of adult learning.
Yeah, I like that because yeah, she did talk about the genealogy, and I think we have to think about the genealogy of it in terms of when you think about who your chair is. My dissertation chair, who I worked with, was Kate Monahan, and when I think about sort of who was her chair, and was believed Ron Severo. And so thinking about that level of genealogy in terms of how his work impacted hers, and I wish I knew, and I should know this, and I apologize that I don't, I should know who his dissertation chair was. But again, thinking about that genealogy and how that trickles down in terms of the work that we do. And I know part of the work, what's always been influential on my work within community-based practice is the planning table. Who's at the
Mm,
table? Who is sitting at the table? And I found myself just recently in a conversation with some work that I was doing for a local nonprofit is we were talking about the planning table. And I said, it's important for us to think about who's at the table, but also what I want to know is who's not at the table. I want to know who's not at the table. And immediately everybody just kind of shook their head like, you're right. Because if we're going to do this and we're planning some youth advocacy work for young adults and workforce, and I said, it's important that we have these partners who are here, but there's a lot of partners who are not at this because they're not receiving funding. We need to think about what their needs are and how do we get their voice as part of this. So just thinking about that genealogy in the planning table and how that just sort of gets passed down from, dissertation chair to dissertation chair, and just thinking about that. So I'll wrap up with this to wrap up this point was just thinking about, those who are working on their dissertations now and doing, the schoolwork. Think about who your chair is, then think about who their chair was, and just know that you're part of that genealogy and that influences your work and you're a part of that kind of that line of work.
100%. Yeah, I
Mhm.
was trying to like while you were talking, I was trying to Google Ron Severo's dissertation and I was not having success. So it's just funny. And then I was trying to look at like so that's the other thing is like, please don't do this for me though. You could look up your dissertation. I mean, for now with like contemporary scholars, you could look at the dissertation of
Mhm.
your professor, your chair, and see like what their work is like. Cause I did grounded theory, right? So it's
Yeah.
like awesome grounded theory. You did what was your was it
I just did a case study.
case study? Oh, not
Yeah.
just a case study. I mean, it's a case study. That's the thing. No, 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 no. Case studies are in depth. There's a lot of information that's needed. Like it's not I don't think
Yeah.
there's just like
True. Very true. Very true.
yeah. So let's I think like did you want to like talk a little bit about the AERC conference, the Adult Education Research Conference that's coming up?
Yeah, let's talk about it. Yeah. So that'll be coming up in May. We will be traveling to Vancouver, Canada,
Mhm.
to present a roundtable on this podcast that we're doing right now. So we submitted the proposal, I'm going to say probably like January, February, earlier part of this year. It was accepted. I think we chose a roundtable because right now we're not really doing research. I think we're really looking more at proposing this idea to later do research, but really would love to get feedback and sort of talk about what we're doing. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. Just a little background, like I was just kind of curious. So the Adult Education Research Conference started in the 1950s, so it's been around for a while. And then this specific conference is in association with the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education.
Hmm.
And so I think they used to do this more often, but then COVID hit. And so the partnerships between the two organizations didn't dissolve. They're weakened a bit.
Yeah,
Like I know like in 2020, I was supposed to go out and I think Vancouver and I was supposed to present on some of my research about informal learning and police officers. And that conference ended up getting canceled.
yeah,
And so this is great. I think this is going to be awesome because we're also going to be, it's not just the Adult Education Research Conference. It's also the Canadian side as well. So we're going to be getting some really good feedback, hopefully.
yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, and I think, what we can talk about is part of what we're hoping to do in addition to presenting at the roundtable is to do some on the spot kind of recordings and interviews of people who are there in attendance at the conference. So I think we'll have to talk about sort of a little bit about sort of what we're looking to gain from that and what we're looking to as, but I'm looking to having some on the spot interviews with people who are there at the conference and recording them and just sharing about sort of some of their work and what they're doing and what they're excited about.
Definitely. I mean, so we might end up looking at the agenda and seeing if there's certain speakers that we could like pull to the side. It won't be something that's like in depth to the point that we were, an hour, like not an hour, but 40-minute conversation. It's gonna be like short, like 5 minutes, 15 minutes at
Yeah.
most. But that's potentially these people could be brought onto the podcast later down the line, which would be
Exactly,
cool.
exactly. And I think part of what I'm interested in, and to your point about, being short little snippets, I think we have to think about sort of the platforms that we're on, using social media, using this as a podcast, and just getting short little bits of information and sound bites of sort of what's happening. I think part of what I'm really excited about with this level of work that we're doing is the level of public scholarship that we're helping to inform. And so, part of some of the research that we're looking at, within our own work here with this podcast is that social media podcasts are a form of public scholarship, and that there has been many studies that have been done out there to use and think about the prevalence of social media nowadays and how scholars are using it to one reach new audiences, but also just thinking about how do we create sort of as you and I are doing now this space for conversations to happen about scholarly work so that it just doesn't live within the libraries or live within books, but is being used to kind of create this space for both voices from the past that we can bring forward, but then also who are the contemporary voices and how do we kind of bring it to a larger, wider audience using social media as a platform.
Agreed. Kind of like going back to Gretchen's point in her interview, I think there's also an importance of having authentic voices, not to be like anti AI, because I'm not.
Hmm.
I'm kind of AI, I don't know, cautious. Like
Hmm.
I'm not full jumping, but like a lot of what we'll be seeing in the future are there's potential for articles to become podcasts, right? Where AI
Hmm.
generates the voices. And we're already seeing this with Google has a platform out there where you can upload a PDF and it'll have a conversation like a podcast like we're doing.
Hmm.
But there's a lack of authenticity when it comes to those types of podcasts versus like we are going out and preserving the voices of the scholars within adult learning, leadership, organization development. And so I think there's just, yeah, authenticity, the human element of
Yeah,
these interviews are extremely important. And so
yeah.
it's another little bias that I have why I'm doing this as well. Not anti AI, but just also cautious, I guess.
No, I think cautious is the right word. And to your point, I think that that's some of the work that, Gretchen has already done with recording some of these foundational voices. And so, I'm very excited, grateful, and thankful for her trusting us to use some of her recordings and to kind of carry those voices forward. Because, and I don't think she would disagree with this, but I don't think that they have been really used to their full potential. I
Agreed.
think that they have kind of, lived within this space that she's created with the conversations for lifelong learning. And I think now, with the work that we're doing and joining with Laura Birma, Catherine Hansman, and Gretchen, is to really think about their use and being able to make sure that they are archived within the Hall of Fame, which I'm really happy that that work is kind of now moving forward. So I think it's timely now that we kind of join in and see what ways we can bring these to, a larger audience and to, classrooms, because I think about myself when I said earlier I go and every now and then I do adjunct. One of the things I'm always looking for with students is referring them to maybe YouTube or something to hear something. If we're going to talk about constructivist learning theory, I want to be able to point to something. And so I go to YouTube, and oftentimes it's just other students who are on YouTube
Right.
talking about their dissertation, talking about something. But how great would it be to be able to have a space and place for students and other educators to be able to go to and hear from those real voices of the person who actually sort of founded the theory. And so I'm looking forward to that and being able to bring that into the podcast.
I agree. And to that point too is when we're talking about practitioners, right? And so when we bring those in, we could for people that are in HRD
Hmm.
training, development, technical assistance, they could potentially even say, okay, here's or listen to this podcast or watch this video clip
Hmm.
of this practitioner who utilized adult learning theory or leadership theory or organization
Hmm.
development theory. And I think that really kind of branches both, right? So we have the
Right.
academic side and that practitioner side.
Right. And you just made me realize something. So, again, I think that this is where the connection is. I'm very interested in helping make that and bridge that connection. Earlier, you mentioned, about me using human centered design theory. And I remember when I was first introduced to human centered design theory, I'm like looking at it, I'm like, well, this is participatory research. This is
Mm,
participatory research. And I'm like, yeah, all the stages of this is just participatory research. So I think the element of what I'm really interested in the work that we're hopefully going to do with this podcast in this format is really help make that connection for practitioners and people that are in the field. Because, with human-centered design thinking, it's something that's very used throughout, organizations, businesses, for-profit, nonprofits, but then also help people who might not have that scholarly background connect to sort of the fundamental research theories that are there. Because one of the things that's very important within nonprofit work or just any work is really making sure that it's evidence based. It's
Hmm.
evidence based, and that we're just not kind of just creating this on our own. And so, if this creates an opportunity for practitioners to be able to say, "Oh, I'm using this theory because it's supported by this," I think that's really helpful. And that just made me think about that as this connecting those two in terms of participatory research. And there's other things that are out there that hopefully will kind of bubble up to the surface that we can kind of create in this space.
100%. Giving them the proper tools
Hmm.
to lead whatever type of change or improvement that they want to do, and doing it with a degree of acknowledgement or understanding of how that tool could be used and is which one is the right tool,
Right.
right? Because we're going to
Yep.
talk about multiple
Hmm.
theories, different types of practitioner based models as well. And then not all of them are going to fit the mold. And that's where kind
Hmm.
of these subtle, like I was talking about, like transformational learning, right? The
Hmm.
Mesereau versus the Hogan versus there's going to be those subtle nuances which are going to become extremely important
Right.
in some circumstances.
Right. Right. So I think this is a good time for us to transition to just also continue to talk about the podcast, talking about sort of what our format is and sort of what our proposed format is now. So knowing that, things could change. And again, when we go to the conference in Vancouver, hopefully we'll get some feedback and get some input in terms of other thoughts that, the field has. But, what we're thinking about right now is sort of the podcast will have a format of having sort of these archival conversations that we've discussed. So having clips of the conversations for lifelong learning from Gretchen Birch. So bringing in, little snippets of those conversations from some of the foundational therapists and just kind of revisiting those and hearing their voices. But then also thinking about who are the contemporary voices, who are contemporary theorists, adult educators, leaders within the field of adult learning now, who are those contemporary voices, but also thinking about who are the practitioners out there. And I think that that's one thing that will be a little bit different than maybe sort of what maybe Gretchen did, is really bringing in sort of that practitioner based lens as well as sort of the theoretical academic voices. But then part of what we're looking to do, you and I believe, is then translate that and think about the bridge. So we have these archival voices, we have these current contemporary voices. What's the connection? What is the difference? And I think one of the things that I'm really interested in sort of embedding into this is a very similar framework that Gretchen used, where she just sits and talks with people. And just, I think there was just simply like 3 or 4 questions that she asked them in terms of, talk a little bit about your work, I'll talk a little bit about who you are, and then tell me something about the future, which I thought was very interesting because she said that she didn't want them to necessarily talk about the future of adult education, but just what do you see as coming forward in the future. And so I think
Mhm.
following sort of a very similar script, hopefully we can kind of continue this very kind of similar conversation with some of the people that we'll talk
Agreed. And bear with us while we do it because we're learning as we go through this, right? So we're waiting for the expert to arrive.
to. Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so there's going to be moments we'll stumble. There'll be moments where we might change the format on you again. We're trying to get it right. We're going to
Right.
figure it out. But I think it's all a part of the process and it's going to be a fun ride.
Mhm.
And there's going to be a lot of learning along the way.
Definitely, definitely looking forward to it.
Well, I think that concludes today. Always want to say this statement. If you have any questions or if you want to be a guest on our podcast or show, email odlearninglab@gmail.com. Again, that's odlearninglab@gmail.com. You could also find us online and social media at OD Learning Lab. And hopefully we hear from you. If not, just tune in and hear where
Right.
our next conversations. Thank you for joining us in the OD Learning Lab. If you have any questions, feedback, or are interested in being a guest on the show, please contact us at odlearninglab@gmail.com. We love to hear from you. Until next time, keep leading, keep learning, and we'll see you back in the lab.